Hello and welcome back to How to D&D More Good with me, Dread Roberts. And today I've got a friend of mine, Paul Harrison. Hi, Paul. How's it going?
Hi there. I'm fine. There's plenty of us about. Paul Harrison being a very common name out there.
I like to think you're one of the definitive ones that I've met. And,
One of the older ones, certainly.
And today, it's quite an interesting position actually, because you're somebody I know who's been DMing. See, I thought I've been DMing a long time. I've been DMing for like 20 something years, and I thought I was like up there with one of the veterans, but apparently not. So today we're going to talk about your experience of D&D. But first, could you give us a little bit of background on your history with TTRPGs in general?
Well, yeah, I mean, the first tabletop role play I did was Dungeons and Dragons itself, back in the early days when a friend introduced me in senior school to drawing maps on grid paper, and we had giant rats in dungeons, and there was no role play going on, but it was, here's the character going through a dungeon type thing. I was about 12, 13 years old or something, so this is late 70s. And from there I progressed to seeing some supplements from D&D with actual adventures written in them, and one or two maybe run by a friend, and then I started DMing myself. So I've been DMing not just D&D but a number of tabletop role-playing games since about 1980, something like that.
Wow.
D&D I started with, but I've done a number. My big ones that I've done for a long time include Paranoia.
It's a cool game.
Serenity.
I've played that.
Well, Paranoia is a great game. Yeah. Not so much for a campaign, but it's good for a 1 or 2 sessions type thing. The campaign I'm currently running has been running for about 13 years. Serenity role-playing game, based on the Firefly TV series and the Serenity film. That's brilliant because you trap a party in a closed situation, and you can take them relatively wherever within the setting. You don't have this complicated journey times and in D&D or other settings you might want to get from this part of the world to this part of the world, and you go, well, that's going to take you weeks of travel, and do you spend a lot of time DMing what the journey is, or is it more important to do the stuff that's at the other end? As they say, the journey's the thing, but not necessarily in this case. Whereas in Firefly, most of the time it's the other end, what's happening there. But I do like running the campaigns where they're trapped and something happens in mid space. And this also has happened in D&D, when you get the party trapped in a situation they can't get out of. Some of the best role play happens where the players are metaphorically at each other's throats. The characters are, and it's character interplay, and almost hardly any adventure of what I've written happens.
Right.
And it's just relying on the players doing bickering, fighting, stabbing each other, nicking from each other, and so on. And even if they're decent characters, the situation drives them to extremes. And they are demanding of things. They're demanding of the paladins, demanding them to behave properly, and the rogues nicking stuff, and the bards playing awful tunes, and and he's making up. I did it once when I played a bard, and I was making up this long. We had to prove ourselves in court, justify ourselves as why we were in this land, and I did this long bardic poem that basically ridiculed other members of my party and bigged myself up whilst justifying ourselves. And my name was dirt in the party for ages on that one, even though I'd saved the party by not getting us locked up.
At what cost?
At the cost of their names, yes. So yes, I've been D&Ding for a good number of years on that sense.
Nice. I mean, it's probably quite an open-ended question, but how do you feel it's sort of the main ways it's changed? Because sort of, from my experience, it was a very niche thing back in. Because I started playing, but maybe sort of similar age to you,
very,
about 13,
very
14.
much so.
It was,
there was
most people
one
never
Games
heard
Workshop when I was young, down at sort of the edge of Hammersmith Road in School Park, and it was difficult to get hold of some of these games. You just didn't find them in like, I mean, where we used to buy them. There was the odd game shop. Yes, that was it. There was not an independent game shop that would be around, and you'd go there and they would stock some D&D. And but GMing back then, it was more about you followed the adventure that they was written, and that's a perfectly fine way to run a game.
Mhm.
But there wasn't so much of the role play. I don't think wasn't encouraged as much in the early days as working to following the plot, getting on with it, getting it done. That's developed over time. It's a lot less concerned with what your stats are as to what your background is, how your character is as a person, and how you're going to interact with the others. That's far more developed over time nowadays. And even with when I've played with much younger members of the parties, they're much more keyed up for this character interplay than they are forcing them down a route of we must solve this problem, let's do this. No, let's do this in the head of my character. Even if that isn't the optimal route. That's definitely a big change that's happened over time.
Do you think that's a game mechanics change? So that the way the actual games have evolved over the generations has meant there's more emphasis on that, or is it more of a societal thing, or is it just the fact that now TTRPGs have been running for so many years, people have sort of shaped them into what they actually wanted them to be all along?
It's a bit of both. I mean, one of the early games I played was Chivalry and Sorcery, I think it was called. The most involved, complicated game that was just unplayable. Brilliant for character creation in the sense that you could spend 3 sessions creating your character and you knew everything about your character. But the most complicated game, and then even Paranoia, the earlier Paranoias, the game was clunky. The mechanics didn't really work. It's like Windows 3.1 versus Windows 7 or 8 or even XP. It was clunky. It hadn't been. They'd thought of it, but they hadn't really thought through. Well, we don't have to stop there. We don't have to make a progression. We can take a bigger jump. I think one of the biggest steps came with simplifying the rules. Came with the Roll20 systems of D&D.
Yes.
When that came in and we got, I loved running campaigns in AD&D Second Edition.
See, that's what I've started
so
on.
much content.
AD&D Second Edition, yeah, that's my first experience.
A couple of years ago,
D&D.
I tried running a campaign of AD&D because all of the Al-Qadim stuff was written, the Arabian Adventures was written in AD&D Second Edition. But it's so clunky to go back to that compared to one of the more modern systems. That in the end I just converted everything back over to the new system and ran it that way, and then just had to convert all the NPCs and monsters and everything else into the newer system. It did mean that some characters couldn't have quite what they were back then, but there were some deliberately min-maxing of characters going on in AD&D Second Edition. Much as it was great involvement, and it had your Rogue's Handbook and your Warrior's Handbook and everything, and some nice ideas, and you could be a swashbuckler and lots of interesting things. You can still do that in the new one, but that's more concepts and flavour than it is complicated rules of min-maxing to go that way. But yeah, so rules have definitely made themselves easier in order, I think, to appeal to a younger audience as well. To make it more accessible for new, not necessarily younger, but new players, certainly. To make people pick it up. They can get the basics of basic D&D. They can go, right, okay, and then if they want to develop their character and play something a bit more complicated, or as they progress through the levels, they learn more complicated skills. That's easier now. Especially when you've got things like D&D Beyond and the like, and other online systems, Roll20, where they've built in those rules within there. That helps you learn your new abilities, your new traits, and so on. Obviously, we didn't have all the online gaming back then at all. We didn't have all those facilities, and you relied on playing D&D or other games with those you could physically connect with. And that did sometimes mean smaller parties back then. I think that most of the times parties were smaller, because that was the party size you had, unless you had a good core of friends who all played D&D and geeks to find each other. So it wasn't as easy as it is nowadays.
I think I was quite lucky in that respect. We had quite a sort of dedicated group, and I think the first, it was before. It was just a couple of us. Just me and one friend, or me and another. Where you'd get these kind of pre-written adventures, like you were saying, where even all the descriptions of the different rooms and the different areas and monsters would all be laid out. So one person could effectively just read, "You have entered the dungeon, and there is slime dripping from stalactites." And they would read it out of the book. And there was another person I was chatting to. So I found it quite a shock, because in some of those games you could play the whole party. You've got your pre-made characters, and you've got your wizard and your cleric and your thief. And when I actually joined an actual D&D group of sort of friends' house, I was like, "What do you mean I only get to pick one character?" And they were like, "Right, how well do you know D&D?" Like, "I've been playing it for ages." Like, "You're going to be a fighter, not a human fighter." That's all they let me be for my first character, just till I figured it out.
I think one of my first characters was a character I still occasionally play. Was a gnome illusionist, and just finding clever ways to use spells and be tricksy. But it didn't mean that we had a balanced party. So my characters tended to die a lot when we had small parties, because we didn't have a big balanced party, and the DM hadn't tailored the campaign to cope with the fact that you've only got 2 or 3 players. And nowadays, obviously, that's encouraged to tweak it down so that it's a bit more balanced and things. But you still want a challenge, obviously.
Those are the days where you had to have a cleric, otherwise you die because no one else could heal.
That's a relatively recent thing. This idea that you didn't have to have a cleric, and there's a lot more healing abilities out there with other races and self-healing things, and that applies not just in tabletop role plays, but in MMO RPGs and things. They have a lot of classes and specs that can do a bit of self-healing or a little bit of healing of others, and there's less reliance on this pure healer in a lot of situations. There's something definitely to be said for them, for a pure healer. You can hold the party to ransom for how they behave if they want healing. They can rely on you as the moral authority of the party.
Did you find like there was a lot more theatre of the mind, or a lot more sort of miniature-based play?
I've been through phases where it was miniature-based, but a lot of it was in the mind. I think the way we now do things online a lot more, and that enables us to bring up maps and diagrams and pictures and so on. There's a lot more of that going on now because it's online. It's easy to do that and share the materials online than I've found with tabletop. With tabletop, I find it is still a lot more in the mind. You might lay out a particular fight that's going on so that everyone can work out what's going on in a fight situation. But beyond that, everything's in the mind. Whereas when I run a game online, I'm sharing maps, I'm showing diagrams, I'm showing pictures of NPCs, all sorts of things, so they can get it in their heads what's the situation that they're in and who they're meeting.
So I'm guessing. Sorry, I'm asking a lot of questions today. So I do. So
go for it.
You've got quite a few games going on at the minute, then. So I know quite a few people who started playing D&D and then kind of went to uni and had a long, because that was my situation as well. So had a long break from it, sort of a few years break, and then carried on. I know some people who have just been consistently playing TTRPGs as a regular thing for decades.
I think I've whether it's tabletop or online versions of tabletop, I think I've been doing it almost solidly since my early years. There may have been a break for a few years when I was starting out in work and I'd moved away from home, and therefore I wasn't around those friends anymore, and we obviously didn't have online as an option. So there was probably a break for maybe 5 years or something like that. The cool period when we wanted to track girls, But the main reason was not that. The main reason was I'm away from the friends who do that gaming. So apart from that, once I get back to a hometown and I'm settled in a hometown, I was able to then find others, get together, get groups going, and join other people's games and run my own games. But almost solidly, even at university. I mean, at university I set up the War Games and Roleplay Society at the university because they didn't have one. I went, nope, we're not having that. Let's set it up, and boom, straight away popular, no problem at all. We ran tabletop roleplay, we ran war games, and we ran live roleplay as well.
I bet it's even easier now. I really do, because I remember really struggling to find people who'd even heard of it at some point. So didn't thought it was just a board game, or didn't know what it was. And now I think it's just
Well,
become a lot more popular.
it's made much more mainstream now. I mean, admittedly, say 20, 30 years ago, there was the D&D cartoon. So
Yes, there was.
people nowadays are aware of it from that. Maybe that was their first hearing of it, of it. But it's not. That's not really what the game is. But it gives you a hint of things in it. But it's far more mainstream nowadays. You can find it in the shops. The kids are growing up with playing computer games, and some of those computer games will be fantasy-based computer games. So they are playing warriors and mages and wizards and all sorts of different things. So they're growing up with this being the norm rather than this being geeky or nerdy. Yeah. This is mainstream, and Lord of the Rings and things comes out. So this is mainstream fantasy. Is there in culture? Harry Potter. It's all there as a mainstream culture thing to be doing, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly big business and everything like that. And of course, if it's big business, the companies want to promote it. It's there in the shops. It's much more there in your face for people to see, and therefore go, oh yeah, I'm into Doctor Who. I'd like to take part in the Doctor Who role-playing game, or Firefly, or Stargate, or Star Wars, or Star Trek, whatever it is. I've played in role-playing games probably for all of these different things and more, and a lot of them were because people were into that universe, and just go, yeah, I'd like to play in that universe. Once they've already played something like D&D, it gives them the idea that, well, yeah, I can take that and I can do it in this universe.
It's ultimately the same kind of system. It works a very similar way. Yeah, you might roll different dice and have different numbers, but the core elements of any TTRPG, I think, are talk to some people.
I mean,
solve a problem.
You could even use generic systems like GURPS.
Yes.
Which I've played with GURPS, and at the time it was okay, and it was better than what I was using. But now even that feels clunky compared to modern latest role-playing games. So I wouldn't go back to GURPS, but you can use some systems and just say, we'll transpose that system into this. So there's modern Roll D20, there's futuristic Roll D20, or there's the Cortex system that Firefly uses can be transposed into other settings. So it's quite interesting, the fact that it's much more accessible. It doesn't matter that once people get the idea that they want to play, they want to role play with a group of other people, they go, I could do that in almost any setting. I can be a unit of troopers doing this. I can be starship fighters. I can be a wizard and mage. I can be all sorts of things. I could be Cthulhu investigators. Well, that takes me back to a creepy game once that somebody once ran. It was really dark outside. Yeah. So someone had left. The GM had deliberately left a small window open, and there was a cold draft down the back of our necks as he's describing everything. Deliberately used that chill within the room to set the atmosphere. That was a cracking game. I remember that one was just a one-off.
Do you ever find? I mean, I can find this sometimes. I feel like D&D's become a little. I know you say about being part of the mainstream, but it feels like it's a little bit kind of watered down sometimes, or it's become much more like sort of cartoony, I guess. Because it used to be, I know it was fantasy, but it was always had like a sort of grim, dark element to it, which I quite liked in a lot of the materials.
I found that some of it could be grim dark. I mean, you can do your Ravenloft, you can do your Curse of Strahd or whatever. So it can do the dark stuff, but it can equally do other things. So I'd say I've run Arabian roleplay, but yeah, that tends to involve some dark and light elements. So it'll involve genies, but it'll equally involve dark sorcerers and things like that that they've got to deal with. But yeah, I think the advantage of D&D is that it has that flexibility. That it can give people, they can have campaigns that are dark, they can have campaigns that are very deeply serious if you want. Equally, they can have light-hearted games, they can have dungeon crawls, they can have cross-land adventures, they can have adventures just set in one or two towns type thing. It has that flexibility now, and there's so much written for it that it enables that flexibility for whatever people want.
What kind of games do you like running? Then what's have you got, do you like to mix it up, or after kind of so many years of doing it, do you find yourself you've got your sort of themes and types of game you like to stick to?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier the trapping players. That trapping players. If you think about a lot of stories from TV, films, etc., where emotions are high, it's where the characters are stuck together and can't get away. In Doctor Who, these stories are classed as base under siege.
Okay.
Makes sense. They're stuck in the collapsed building, tunnel system, spaceship, whatever. There's power issues. Think of Alien. You're trapped on that spaceship that's got power problems because they're eating the systems and they're attacking you. You've got no. It forces intense role play. You have to give the players something to work towards together. You give them a time limit, be it food, oxygen, safety from whatever is attacking them, and something they've absolutely got to solve. And some of my best sessions, as I say, come from them just put them together, and they'll squabble. They'll be at each other's throats. I did one where I had a crew at each other's throats because there was a hallucinogenic gas, making them think that each other person was a stranger, and they role played it really well, and they very nearly killed each other, but didn't quite. And thereafter, the common one of these tropes that was running through future sessions was no grenades on board the spaceship because grenades got thrown. So yeah, I like those. I mean, I've run. I like the Al-Qadim. I like the Arabian Adventures setting. I like general D&D, but I tend to play in other people's campaigns for that. I've run, let's say, this Serenity campaign for about 13 years.
Nice.
I occasionally have run Paranoia. Doctor Who, I run a role-playing game off and on for those as one or two sessions for those. I don't, apart from the Firefly, which even then I still take a break. I'll take a 6-month break and say, well, we'll pick this up after the summer LARP season. Yeah, it's always difficult to necessarily get the games together at that time, and it gives me a break mentally, and then I can come up with some ideas ready for things, and I trawl the internet and go, nick that idea from this, nick that idea from that, nick that idea from that, and then expand on it and write the adventure. But yeah, burnout is always a problem. When I was used to be running D&D or any campaign on a weekly basis, you can burn out after 2 or 3 months as a GM. Right now I run it every 2-4 weeks. That's much more flexible. Yeah, it allows me time. I can even thinking, I'll just do this as a one-off or 2 or 3 sessions. It still gives me time to go, well, do you know what? I've got another idea. I'll set that up for the future, and it ends up almost running straight on from the other one. So I'm taking less breaks nowadays, but even if I sometimes flip between campaigns as to what I'm running. Things I love to play, lots of different things. I like a lot of variety. I'm not a big fan of straight dungeon crawls, but variety.
See, I don't tend to. Whenever I try and plan a dungeon crawl, in my mind, I think, this is going to take them forever to figure it out. And then the 8 puzzles I put in there, they're either too. I make them too difficult, and they get bored and figure out a different way of doing it, or I end up making the dungeon too short and too easy. So I do tend to avoid them, really. I know some people are great. I've played in some games where the entire game is pretty much a dungeon crawl. Then you go to a town. It doesn't have to be a dungeon. It could be getting through the forest and the swamp, or you have to get through some location with lots of problems and traps in it. And yeah, I wish I was better at that.
I like giving them options. When I write an adventure, I like to give the party options. They can approach the problem from different angles. So you've got to think about one of the big things about when writing a campaign is to link the stories to the characters, to the party, so that you know who are they, what are their strengths and weaknesses, what are they likely to want, what do they want as players to do, but what are their strengths as their characters. So I'm not going to give them a problem where they've got to sit down and decipher something if none of their characters or players are really good at that sort of thing.
Yes, or even interested in that.
Yeah. So one of the key things I do when I run a campaign and get new players in, or new characters in, if the characters die and they come as a new character, is I get a paragraph or two, no more than a page, from each player on character background. And it has to include family, so who is alive, where are they, and anything interesting about their family, any enemies, previous work experiences, places visited, and why they visited them if necessary, character weaknesses, are they a compulsive gambler, a drinker, a carouser, these sorts of things. This will give you a feel for your campaign, and also gives you something to go into their background and go, oh, do you know what? That old flame that they had previously, let's have them resurface. Let's have them suddenly need to be rescued or turn up as a baddie. Why not have that baddie is suddenly someone they knew from their past, and it makes it really personal to them. I've seen this in live role play as well as tabletop, and it really gets we're emotionally committed to this rather than it's just a generic story. To get them that emotional buy-in from the players is very important. So it doesn't need much background, but that those key things in there. I've had one character who was buried alive because he was a compulsive gambler. He lost his bet with some bad people, and they buried him alive. But fortunately, the party found him before it was too late. But it's just these things make a memorable moments in the game.
I've definitely found that with the current campaign I'm running in. I'm sorry, go ahead. You're all good.
I had another one where a guy was a compulsive fixer of things. He couldn't help himself, trying to tweak anything. And in this case, he was tweaking. I mentioned that the fridge on the spaceship was playing up a little bit. Oh, I can tweak that. So the next person who grabs it, the hand freezes to the handle. Now you've got an emergency. You've got a player whose hand is frozen to your fridge, and the longer you leave it, it's getting worse. And in the end, they had to amputate the hand and get a robotic hand and pay out a fortune for this. And it created all sorts of purely from one character's compulsiveness to do stuff.
That's cool.
Overclocking everything.
I like that.
Yeah. I just linking everything into the players and just finding something that we can combine them, whether it's a downside and upside, something from their background. So I use the weaknesses. I had one, if they're a drunkard, I let them open a door to an incredible wine cellar or a very rare bottle of, unbeknownst to them, infected spirits. So they're going to drink it, but there's going to be a bad downside to it. Maybe it'll make the first person they see look incredibly desirable to them, and it's a member of the party, and that's going to be awkward to work out. I just love finding these character buy-ins into stuff, whatever campaign I'm running, so that they really are involved. Yeah,
I love that. No, that's cool. So, actually using that, the campaign I'm running most recently, like the big bad of the main antagonist, just no real interest. They just know it's an obstacle. There was, like I said, no emotional buy-in, but there was a minor villain who were stabbed. It was at some an intelligence gatherer for some guild that they were opposed to, and he got their shop shut down by some legal loophole because the party had a shop. Then when they tried some retribution, he did a sneak attack against one of the characters and stabbed him through the heart. And then they were like one minute away from death or something. The rest of them solved it, and it was just meant to be some minor obstacle. But they hated this NPC so much. Like whenever he showed up, they were like, they were just so desperate to kill this guy.
I have done that where someone who's a relatively minor character that they've come across, they've made a big thing about. And you're right. Well, I'll make a big thing about him in future. He'll come back. This shopkeeper that they've interacted with a lot, they're going to meet him again. I'll maybe make him part of the magical shop chain that appears all over the place. There was a cartoon I saw the other day which says, the party will take these horrible, almost beaten to death by the by this big bad, but it dare kick the party's dog. Oh, yeah.
How could you?
You dare kick our mascot or whatever, even if it's just you sends him flying across the room for no damage. No, you don't do that to Ruffles or whatever it is. It again, it's that emotional buy-in for whatever reason. Insulting their brother or something like that. When you've got information on their background, and maybe the big bad knows something about their background and goes, "Hang on, I've not told the rest of the party this. Now this has just come out. Now I've got to explain this horrible secret I've been keeping from the rest of the party, and the big bad knows my secret." Anything that is an emotional buy-in. I do like what you said about just it's a minor character. But yeah, I've done that, and it's great fun to do that.
You know, on the thing you said about the background as well, and the people they might know, like an old flame or an old contact or somebody they owe money to or something. I did it when I found it on the internet. I tried it; worked really well. It's called the I Know a Guy rule. So my campaigns tend to be split into like arcs. You know, so one arc, maybe sort of 8, 9, 10 sessions, just to resolve that bit of plot and then move on. But once an arc, they can do the I Know a Guy rule. So, you know, for example, they needed some information on something, and they can pick somebody from their background, and they can invent an NPC. And I think one of the examples we had was Honest Stu, I think his name was. An Honest Stu who was a debt collector who was known to this character and used to work with him once. And then all of a sudden that became, and we had Greb the Goblin Labourer, who was in there, and they love these characters because they invented them themselves, and it's their sort of go-to.
Your mention of Honest Stew reminded me that when I used to run classic D&D campaigns, every town had an Honest Mart's Emporium. The big cities may have multiple ones, like Honest Mart's Weapons Emporium, Honest Mart's Potions Emporium. All of them are staffed by a man called Honest Mart. In Al-Qadim, it was Honest Ahmed. All of them always look the same, they sound the same. No one ever explains why.
It's just a given.
No matter where they go, they'll always have the standard stuff in stock, always at a fair quality, and always 10% over book price. But you know it's going to be fair quality. Yeah. But good luck finding any competitor's potion shop in the same town. It's like they're the Waterstones. They swamp out the competition. So it's like, yeah, you can get this chain everywhere, but you can't buy you can't get it cheaper elsewhere. And these shops appear. I didn't come up with this in originally. It was a friend of mine came up when I was quite young, and unfortunately he died when he was quite young. I know, keep it light. But he had this character, and it was Jim Bobbin, but he ran this Honest Marts in the campaign, and I've used it ever since.
That's cool. I like
that. The number of times they've gone, is it a doppelganger? Are they a string of brothers? Are they clones? What's going on here? It's not important. It doesn't matter. And the shopkeeper will know them as well, so it is the same person basically in every shop. Just drives them nuts. Just to agree, that's something that I call the DM signature. It's just you have a little motif, something that's in all your campaigns. These things run through. Maybe whatever it is, it could be. Maybe everyone wears hats. The more ridiculous and bigger for more important NPCs, the better. So you can tell how evil someone is by the fact that he's got a 10-foot stovepipe hat. Whatever it is, maybe magic is unreliable for whatever MacGuffin reason. Random spells end up with random bizarre effects. I loved when they introduced wild magic in AD&D.
Wild magic's fun.
Oh,
it was crazy about
that. Yeah. Oh yeah, it was very crazy. I mean, it was very unreliable. You were powerful as a sorcerer, but you were unreliable because you didn't know what you were going to cause. Usually, if you chucked a 3rd level spell, I'll give you a 3rd level spell that would do something impressive. It may not be your fireball. It may be something else completely different. And you go, oh, you've suddenly caused this disease plague cloud. We better move. The wind's blowing it in our direction. It's done the job over there, but unfortunately it's now blowing our way. We can't go that way anymore. You know, I loved that sort of stuff. But anyway, I love campaigns where people, DMs have tailored things and have put their own touch on the campaign. Even if it's a book campaign, you can do that. You can turn around and go, let's change the name of that NPC and have, you know, Honest Mart in my case type thing appears, or it could be Stavros appears, you know, running everything, whatever it is, just something that makes it very unique to your campaigns. That are just going, oh right, okay, this version always has these in it.
I like to do that sort of thing with because I tend to have reasonably short campaigns, maybe sort of 10 to 30 sessions, and then they tend to, because I find by then normally like my sort of love for the plot has worn out and I've come up with something else. So I tend to keep campaigns kind of reasonably short in that respect. But something I do is I'll drop something from the previous campaign, if it's the same players, into the current one. And I normally sort of throw it in at the little minute when, like for example, the big bad in one campaign was mentioned as who the characters killed in the last session was mentioned as a still living person in the next campaign. They're like, we're in the same world.
I mean, in the Serenity role-playing game, so I've been doing that for say 13 years now. It's a bit different because the crew has come and gone. If I was running that, most times one character maybe will die a year. Something will happen that a character will die. It might be that two leave. Maybe a party. Maybe a player quits the campaign because they go off and do other things, and someone else comes in. So yeah, they either leave or die, and there's been turnover. And they're on about their fourth ship or something, but it's still the same campaign. And occasionally I've introduced something when you're going, and some of the players are the same players from way back yonder, from the beginning. And they'll remember the fact that they helped this guy defeat the previous president of the Alliance, and so the guy they've helped is now was a good guy. Power is corrupting him. He's turning a bit bad, and they're remembering this, and they're going, "But he should be a good guy. We got to go and get him, make him good again. You know, we got to go and help this. You know." And they love that connection back to the early stuff.
Unfortunately, we're kind of coming to the end of the time. So I get the impression we could just chat about this for ages. So
I've got loads of stuff I could talk about.
I mean, I'm sure we'll do repeat at some point. Oh yeah, Nemesis. We'll talk about villains because I love a good villain.
I mean, one of the things I love is when you mentioned something about having a recurring nemesis, whether it's a court official, a high-ranking politician, and they don't have to kill the baddie; they just have to defeat their plans.
Yes.
That allows you to have a recurring baddie. Yeah, you don't have to have a Darth Maul situation. You can have a Darth Vader situation where he goes on and he's there for a number of situations. Maybe he keeps adding conditions before they get paid. Have them escape, but it doesn't mean that the person they meet to go, oh, it's not them, it's a lackey representing them, or it's a hologram, or it's a projection, or it's a vision of them, or it's a body double. It could be all sorts of things. You don't have to have that baddie there at the end of that small part of the campaign. Also important is to think about the baddie. If you're writing the adventure, have them be a step ahead of the party as much as you can. For example, have the big baddie warn a village about this party, go, oh, you can't trust these people if they turn up. And then the party is really shunned when they go to a village, and they don't know why.
I love it when the villain is when the villain's on the side of the law, for example, or on the side of whoever's in power. So you can't, characters can't just assassinate them because then they spend the rest of their lives in prison. The campaign would be over. I find they tend to hate those villains a lot more than just some chaotic force from the wilderness.
I've had it where they had a recurring villain who was trying to become president of the Alliance for ages, and now they've actually had to recruit the villain to help them because they desperately needed him to solve an even bigger problem. It's like we've got to side with the guy we don't want to side with, and that's always fun. So yeah, Nemesis, having recurring villains is important, I find. I say I could go on talking about these things for ages, and loads of other things to do with campaigns of.
Well, what we should do next time then? We should have one. I'll have you back on again if you'd like to. We could probably go into a lot more detail on some aspects because I really want to get into the kind of the DM tips and the more specific versions of it. Like there's the concept of the hidden kind of puppet master villain, the person who they meet. On sort of session one, someone they're going on a few adventures with, a kind of minor person who they don't think is particularly powerful, who it turns out has been incredibly powerful and has been manipulating everyone around him the whole time. Like someone who's a bit of a klutz or seems like a bit of an idiot, or someone who seems kind of sort of happy-go-lucky, harmless, and then it turns out they're actually quite harmful indeed. Like, I love those sorts of villains. But I've overplayed it, so now they expect every kind of innocent villager they meet that they secretly like...
Yeah.
So I've had to stop doing it to change the expectations.
Yeah, you've got to have some that are straightforward, yes, in order to put the twist in occasionally. Yeah.
So yeah, I'll do. Sorry, I was going to say I'll definitely ask you, invite you back. But in the last sort of few minutes, have you got any sort of tips? So I guess people, because I love DMing more than playing. It's just my jam. there are people who have been playing for a long time and want to get into DMing and maybe think it's a little bit too overwhelming, maybe, or there's too much in it, have you got any sort of tips or advice for people in that situation?
Who are unsure of taking it up?
Yeah, I'd like to give it a go, but don't know where to start.
It's one of those things that puts off a lot of people is rules, and you don't need to have know the rules. I have run campaigns. I've run D&D, so not D&D. I've run Doctor Who role playing games, where the players haven't a clue what the system is. It's not important. I'll send them some. They'll choose their character from the universe and that they want to play, and I'll say, here's these stats. They're not that irrelevant. You know what the character's like. You know what they're good at. Can they use a sonic baseball bat? Can they use, are they any good with martial arts? Are they any good at acrobatics? You know those basic things. That's all you need to know. If I tell you to roll 2d6 and you roll 2d6 and the aim is to roll high, then you know that's the thing. You don't need to know any more rules than that. Yeah. Once you start developing a campaign and developing characters and where those characters gain extra skills and so on, which is much more important in D&D as you level than it is in a lot of others. In the Serenity one, you gain a few tweaks and extra skills and things like that, but there's none of this leveling stuff. You are still the same character, just getting a bit more worldly wise, with a bit more rounded, as it were, with things you've picked up and learnt along the way. But to start out with, for new people, you don't need to know the rules. Yeah, speak to the person who's running the game. They can create a character for you. If you just have a talk to them about what you want to play, they'll create a character for you. They'll talk you through the very basics of all you need to know and help you out. And you don't need to worry about the rules. They're not that complicated. In the vast majority of games nowadays, they've fixed the problems where it was clunky as hell.
Yes. Especially, as you mentioned before, with D&D Beyond Roll20, where you can just click the button and it does the thing for you.
Once you know how the mechanics of the software works and what I'm meant to be clicking and where, and the same applies to if you're using Forge or Foundry or whatever the other online tools are, Roll20 and so on. Is it /roll or exclamation mark roll or what am I doing here? Once you know that, it doesn't matter. You roll it, you roll the dice. And the DM tells you whether it's successful or how successful it is and what happens. You don't need to know anything more than that, and you know that your character is strong or intelligent or clever or witty or whatever it is. That's another thing we could talk about. Is like playing against character type.
Yes,
it can be a challenge to play someone stupid or someone witty and erudite at times, and AD&D gives you the opportunity to come out of your shell and play something different, but sometimes that can be difficult, certainly as a starting character for you, to play someone, say a bard that completely thinking of now I've forgotten his name, the guy from The Witcher.
Jaskier.
Jaskier. Him in second season is this rocking bard that can control the room absolutely every time. You can't do that when you come in straight unless you are an absolutely erudite, outgoing person, an extrovert. But you can learn to be that because D&D and other tabletop role-playing games can bring you out of your shell and bring out that confidence to play stuff that you wouldn't otherwise play.
I'd kind of say I agree with that.
We can talk about those things.
I'd say for new people, because I always made the mistake of trying to build the world, like the top-down approach, build the multiverse, and then work down to the adventurers. But I'd always say start with the adventurers, put them in a town, give them a problem, run that session, and then build it up. Don't you?
You can have some basic outlines.
Yeah, a few ideas. But
that's another thing we can talk about is how detailed do you go in your adventure? Don't go to, because the party will do different stuff to what you had planned. Almost inevitably, they'll do some stuff differently. So, but having an idea of what that is up there, you have another tip I'd always say is for DM is having a list of NPC names, some with positions, some just ready to drop in when they suddenly need to know the name of this shopkeeper.
Write a description. In my case, accent, because I try and do a different accent for each NPC. Remember which accent each person talks in, because your players will pull you up.
My joke is I'm a man of 1,000 voices, all the same. But I do try on that, and I do try not to be offensive characters, accents and so on. We did start when we were doing the Arabian Adventures with "Peace be upon you" and "Upon you peace," and we slowly migrated away from that to be just our normal accents.
It's implied.
With the words. It's implied that we are these Arabian characters. We were suddenly going, it was fun to begin with, now we're going, this isn't necessarily appropriate. Which is fair. Fine. But yeah, so yes, it is about, as you say, it's about the party, it's about the characters. What do they need to know? What's going to impact them in the world that they're going to play with the world, as it were. But we can talk about that. Some tips and things for DMs to make that run smoothly. Well, it's been absolutely lovely talking to you.
Yeah, it's been a joy, mate. Thank you very, very much for your time. And I'll if you're definitely up for it, I'll have you back in the future. So thank you very much for listening and watching.
No,
watched.
Have me back in the past. That'd be much more fun.
Yes, we'll do that. I'll find a way. I've been Dread Roberts. This has been How to D&D More.
I think you just have to fly around the planet a few times the long way, isn't it?
They won't know that reference. The kids of today, they don't know that's how you do it. But it's been. See you all later. Bye.